US troop reinforcements have begun arriving in Germany as fears over Russia's troop build-up on Ukraine's borders increases. Their first contingent of 2,000 additional US soldiers arriving near Frankfurt overnight, with others touching down near Poland's border with Ukraine. The White House says the troops will protect eastern NATO members from potential Russian aggression, but Russia says they're worsening already high tensions in the region. DW's Alexandra von Nahmen explains what's behind the US decision.
American F-15 fighter jets arriving in Estonia. A Danish frigate deployed to support NATO in the Baltic Sea. More and more allies are sending troops to Eastern Europe. It's not a choice, it's a must, says security expert Bruno Letté.
NATO has to prepare for every possible military scenario. It is not unrealistic, for instance, to think that Russia could create a border incident with Estonia to distract attention from an invasion in Ukraine.
To be prepared, the US alone is sending 1,700 troops to Poland and a 1,000-strong unit to Romania. France wants to send soldiers to Romania as well. The Netherlands is considering deploying fighter aircraft to Bulgaria, so too is Spain. While the UK may dispatch troops to Estonia, and Danish fighter jets have already arrived in Lithuania. Compared to Russia's, NATO presence in the region is still relatively small. But as the Kremlin continues its build-up around Ukraine, NATO is strengthening its defense posture. According to Secretary General Stoltenberg, the alliance is even considering deploying new battle groups in addition to the 4 multinational battalions already in place in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland. The 4 battle groups were deployed in response to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. NATO members argued then that they cannot ignore Russia breaking international rules and undermining peace and stability. And now NATO is confronted again with what they describe as aggressive behavior, and its members are responding with reinforcements. Putin's goal was to have fewer NATO troops close to Russia's border, but so far he has produced the exact opposite. The current crisis, policy analyst Albin Aronson suggests, has galvanized the alliance.
Russia's actions, especially since 2014, have sort of given NATO a new impetus for its core mission, for which it was established to secure Europe, to deter others from invading or potentially destroying the security order in Europe.
And yet that doesn't mean NATO will send combat forces to Ukraine if Putin decides to strike. In fact, the alliance has already ruled it out. But many members are increasing their economic and military aid for Ukraine, with the UK and Poland promising a new security pact.
It is unlikely that the arrangement will be something like NATO-ish, where the UK and Poland would have a duty to defend Ukraine. I think what we will see is cooperation in terms of military training, financing, making sure Ukraine has the military means also to defend itself.
According to NATO, it is all about defending its members. That is the reason for the reinforcements, the alliance says. Russia denounces them as hysteric and destructive. Both sides, however, say they are open to more talks.
For more, let's bring in DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kiev. Nick, these NATO deployments to some countries in Europe, what difference do they make for Ukraine?
Well, I think if anything, Rebecca, they just show Ukrainians the value of being in NATO, something that isn't on the cards anytime soon or even in the middle term for Ukraine right now. This is all about the symbolism of the US reassuring especially smaller NATO members with smaller militaries on that eastern flank on the border with Russia. I think for Ukraine it doesn't do much. Ukraine in recent weeks has heard that all it can expect if Russia does invade are sanctions against Russia, maybe more weapons deliveries and financial aid, but no NATO military boots on the ground here in Ukraine to help the Ukrainian army.
As you rightly point out, Ukraine is not a NATO member, but these are, of course, NATO troops we're talking about. Just talk us through, if you will, Ukraine's relationship to NATO.
So Ukraine got a very kind of elusive pledge that at some point it would be able to join NATO back in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, but that was never really clearly defined. There was no roadmap to joining, and obviously since then Russia has been making very clear that it sees NATO membership for Ukraine as a red line. As it is, US lawmakers have been discussing giving Ukraine the status of a NATO plus member, which would allow it to get US arms more easily, other kinds of support. There have been various kinds of Western training missions for Ukraine's military, and then more in the way of bilateral military aid for Ukraine by the US, by the UK recently supplying those first lethal weapons from the UK recently, but there is no commitment by NATO to defend Ukraine. And as I said before, Ukraine is well and truly on its own if Russia were to invade.
Now, this, of course, all comes in context of the Russian troop build-up next to the Ukrainian border on the other side. How do the numbers compare?
I think this is a really important point because there's been a lot of criticism from Moscow of these US troop movements, but they are tiny compared to what Russia is doing in the same region. So these are essentially 2,000 new troops being transferred across the Atlantic from the US, 1,000 being moved from Germany to Romania. This is pretty paltry if you accept the claim from NATO General Secretary Stoltenberg recently that Russia is sending 30,000 fresh troops to Belarus alone. These are exercises being held between Belarus and Russia in that country that also lies on Ukraine's borders, on top of the 100,000 Russian troops or more along Russia's border with Ukraine. So these really aren't comparable in terms of scale, and this is very much a symbolic move, but nothing that really changes the balance of force in this part of the world.
Now, Nick, I just wanted to also gauge the atmosphere there briefly, if you can. How concerned are Ukrainians right now?
Well, there's a bit of a kind of disconnect between the world's attention on Ukraine and lots of Ukrainians seemingly going about their daily lives without too much of a change. But when you talk to them, they often will tell you that they are slowly coming up with plan Bs, taking cash out in case issues happen with the banks here and they have to leave in a hurry. So there's a bit of a schizophrenic sense of a desire to keep on going, but preparation increasingly for the worst.
All right, Nick, thank you. DW's Nick Connolly in Kiev.